The night sky was black, the kind of black that swallows every star. The wind howled across the frozen plains. Carrying sharp ice that cut like tiny knives, Kane sat alone inside his small shelter, listening to the old metal walls creak under. The force of the storm, the heater in the corner gave a weak, flickering light, just enough to keep the shadows from feeling alive outside. The storm roared like an angry beast, each gust rattling the door as if trying to break it down. Kane had been through bad weather before, but this storm felt different, colder, heavier, like it wanted to bury everything in its path. He was tired, but he could not sleep. The storm made it impossible. Every sound felt too close, too sharp. He sat in his chair with a blanket over his shoulders, his rifle leaning against the wall. Within easy reach, on this frontier world, storms were dangerous. But they weren't always the worst thing out there. Sometimes, it was what came with them that you had to worry about. Kane's supplies were already low. Food had to last another 5 days before the next supply drone could reach him. The heater's fuel was halfway gone, and he had been trying to use as little as possible. He thought about making tea, just to keep himself busy. When suddenly, loud thud slammed against the door. Kane froze. The sound wasn't like ice hitting metal. It was heavier, urgent, almost like a body. The wind screamed outside, but he heard it again, another hit. Then the scrape of something against the frame. His hand moved to the rifle. His pulse quickened. Out here, far from any town. No one knocked on your door during a storm, not unless they had a reason, and usually, it wasn't a good one. The latch rattled, a sharp push followed, and the door creaked open just enough for a rush of snow to blow in. Kane stood, ready to shout. But before he could speak, a small figure slipped through the gap and stumbled inside. The door slammed, shut behind her as if the wind had thrown it. Snow fell from her shoulders as she collapsed to her knees. Breathing hard, Kane blinked, unsure what he was seeing. She wasn't human. Her skin was a pale blue, faintly glowing in the dim light. Strange markings shimmered across her cheeks like living tattoos. Her eyes were closed, her lips trembling. She clutched something small in her hand, a piece of torn fabric. Stained dark. "Hey," Kane started, but she didn't look at him. Instead, she staggered forward. Her movements clumsy, unsteady, like someone running out of strength. Then, without a word, she fell against him, her small frame curling up against his side, as if she had done it 100 times before. Kane stiffened. His instinct told him to push her away, to demand who she was and why she was here. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way her body shook violently. Maybe it was the sharp cold radiating from her skin. Or maybe it was the sound of her breathing, fast, shallow. Desperate, she buried her face against his coat, gripping the fabric tightly, her tail a long, thin shape he hadn't noticed until now wrapped loosely around his leg. Kane's mind raced. What if she was dangerous? What if something had followed her here? What if letting her in was the biggest mistake he could make? He looked toward the door. His shelter was small, barely enough space for one person. It was never meant for guests. And now, in the middle of the worst storm he'd seen in months, he had an alien girl clinging to him like her life depended on it. The heater hissed in the corner, filling the silence with its faint mechanical hum. Kane sat back down slowly, letting her rest against him. Her breathing began to slow, though her shivers didn't stop. He could feel how cold she was, like she'd been walking in the storm for hours without protection. Outside, the wind screamed again, shaking the shelter walls. Kane's eyes kept going to the latch on the door. He had locked it. But the storm wasn't the only thing out there. His gut told him this girl had a reason for finding him, and that reason might be standing in the snow right now, watching. Waiting. She didn't speak, didn't open her eyes. She just stayed pressed against him, as if she knew that once she had made it inside, she wasn't moving again. Kane didn't know her name, didn't know where she came from, and didn't know what danger she had brought with her. But one thing was certain: this stormy night had just become far more dangerous than he'd expected, and deep down, Kane already knew this was only the beginning. The alien girl lay curled up against Kane, her breathing uneven. Her clothes were torn at the edges, the fabric frayed as if ripped by claws. Frost clung to her hair, melting slowly under the weak heat of the shelter. The strange glowing markings on her skin pulsed faintly, dimming and brightening like a weak heartbeat. Kane had seen many alien species on the frontier, but never one quite like her. She was small, barely reaching his chest, and high-tanned, thin. Far too thin, like she hadn't eaten in days. Kane shifted slightly, trying to make her more comfortable. But the moment he moved, her hands clutched his coat tighter. Her tail twitched and tightened around his leg. It wasn't a hostile grip, it was the grip of someone terrified of being left alone. "Hey," Kane said quietly. "You're safe here." His words felt strange. He wasn't sure if she understood human common speech. But even if she didn't understand the words, maybe she could feel the tone. She didn't answer. Her eyelids fluttered, but they didn't open. Kane leaned closer, noticing her skin was cold to the touch, not the natural kind of cold some alien species had, but the dangerous kind, the kind that meant she was close to freezing. Kane grabbed the spare blanket from his bunk and wrapped it around her small frame. The fabric swallowed her almost completely, but she still stayed close to him. As though the blanket wasn't enough without his warmth, he glanced at the heater in the corner. The fuel gauge sat lower than he liked. The storm could last days. And now there were 2 mouths to feed and 2 bodies to keep warm. Kane didn't like the math. He had planned his supplies for 1 person. And even then, he had been cutting it close. Outside, the wind roared, pounding snow against the shelter walls. It sounded like claws dragging along metal. Kane's eyes flicked to the door again. The memory of that heavy thud returned. She hadn't just wandered in here by chance. Know someone? Or something had chased her to his door. Kane stood slowly, prying her hands off his coat with gentle care. She murmured something in her own language, her voice soft and broken. The words were strange, full of soft clicks and drawn-out vowels he didn't understand. But the tone was enough, sounded like a plea. "I'll be right back," Kane muttered. Even though she likely didn't understand, he grabbed his coat, gloves, and rifle, sliding them on with practiced movements the moment he opened the door. The storm shoved against him like a living thing. Snow whipped into his face, the wind tearing at his coat. He stepped outside, the cold biting into his skin instantly. He needed to check the perimeter. He needed to see what Torhu had brought her here. The snow was deep, forcing him to lift his legs high with every step. His boots crunched loudly, though the storm swallowed most sound. Just a few meters from the shelter, he spotted them tracks, small, light footprints that matched her size. They were fresh, partially filled with snow, but still visible. And there was more long, deep marks beside them, claw marks. Something had been following her, something heavy. Kane knelt, brushing away the snow to study the tracks. The claw marks were deep enough to cut into the frozen ground. The stride was wide. The creature or creatures were fast. And judging by the way the tracks overlapped hers, they had been close, far too close. He followed the trail a little farther, just to be sure, but it ended abruptly. The wind and snow had erased the rest, or the thing had turned away. He didn't like either option. The storm could hide them, but it could also hide an ambush, turning back. Kane fought his way through the snow until the shelter came into view again. He stepped inside quickly, shutting the door against the freezing wind. The girl was still curled up where he had left her. The blanket wrapped around her looked too big for her thin frame, but she didn't seem to care. Her eyes were open now, faintly glowing in the dim light. They watched him with quiet intensity. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then she whispered, in broken but understandable human common, "You." Human Kane blinked, surprised she could speak his language at all. "Yeah," he said slowly. "I'm human." She nodded weakly. Then her gaze dropped to the floor. Her hands tightened around the blanket, as if afraid he would take it away. Kane sat back down, still holding the rifle in one hand. He had a lot of questions, a one pressed harder than the rest. "What's out there?" he asked. "Who's after you?" She hesitated, her lips parting as if to speak. Then she closed them again. Her eyes darted to the door, her body tensing. Kane followed her gaze. The wind outside had shifted, the howling just a little different. Almost as if something was moving against it. And in that moment, Kane realized something: she wasn't just an uninvited guest. She was trouble. Trouble that had found his door in the middle of the worst storm of the season. Trouble that had followed her here and might already be closing in. Kane didn't like the feeling in his gut. It was the same uneasy pull he had felt before a predator's ambush on a hunt years ago. The alien girl's eyes kept flicking toward the door as if she could sense something outside, and that alone made him grip his rifle tighter. The storm still screamed against the walls. But every few moments, Kane thought he could hear something else. A deep sound buried under the wind, like a low growl carried on the icy air. He didn't want to leave the shelter, but he also didn't want to wait for whatever was out there. To find its way in, the girl was watching him closely. She didn't speak, but her glowing eyes seemed to plead with him not to go. Kane knelt beside her. "I'll be back," he said, in a low voice. "Lock the door. Don't open it for anything unless it's me." She nodded slowly, her hands tightening around the blanket. Kane dressed, quickly, thick coat, gloves, scarf, and the heavier boots he kept for deep snow. The rifle was loaded, safety off. He stepped to the door, unlocked it, and pulled it open. The wind instantly punched into him, spraying his face with freezing snow. Outside, the world was a blur of white and shadow. Snow whipped sideways across the ground, erasing shapes and hiding movement. The cold bit into his skin even through the layers. He moved slowly, scanning in every direction, careful not to lose sight of the shelter. The tracks he had seen earlier were almost gone, the storm working fast to cover them. He knelt where they began, brushing away fresh snow. The small prints were hers, leading toward the ridge. Beside them, the larger marks deep, spaced far apart. Each ending in sharp claw grooves told a different story. Kane followed the trail uphill. Every step heavy in the deep snow, the wind roared around the jagged rocks, and the air seemed to grow sharper, colder. The claw marks continued for about 20 meters before they stopped, replaced by long, smooth impressions. Like something had dragged itself low to the ground. That meant one thing: the hunter had been stalking her. Lowering its body for a silent attack, Kane's chest tightened. He'd seen similar patterns before, but always from predators on his homeworld, never from anything here. He crouched, listening. The storm made it almost impossible to hear anything, but there a faint, heavy crunch of snow. Too steady to be the wind, Kane turned toward the sound. Squinting through the white haze, for a second, he thought he saw movement, a dark, low shape slipping between the rocks. Then it was gone, swallowed by the storm. Kane's instincts told him to turn back, to not risk losing sight of the shelter. The girl was alone, and if the thing doubled back, she'd be trapped. He retraced his steps quickly, scanning the ridge behind him every few seconds. His boots sank deep, forcing him to push harder against the wind. By the time the shelter came into view again, his coat was heavy with snow. The door was shut, just as he had left it. Kane stepped inside, locking it behind him. The girl was still on the floor by the heater, but she was sitting up now, watching him intently. Her eyes searched his face as if trying to read his thoughts. Kane set the rifle down and knelt in front of her. "There's something out there," he said. "Big, fast, and it's hunting you." Her hands gripped the blanket tighter. Her lips moved as she whispered in her own language before switching to broken human common. "They will not stop." Kane frowned. "Who are they?" She hesitated, then said, "Hunters." The word was heavy, full of fear. "They take a people like me." "Why?" Kane asked, but she shook her head, either unwilling or unable to explain. He had thought about the claw marks, the dark shape, the way the tracks vanished into the storm. Whoever or whatever these hunters were, they were skilled, patient, and not afraid of this weather. That meant they would come again. Kane sat back, glancing toward the door. The storm could buy them some time, but not much. He had faced danger before, but this was different. This wasn't. His fatigue, somehow, it already felt like it was. The girl's voice was barely a whisper when she said, "You help me." Kane met her gaze. Her eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, but beneath that glow was something human enough to understand desperation. He exhaled slowly. "Yeah," he said. "I'll help you." Outside, the wind howled again, carrying with it a faint, distant sound. Not quite a roar, not quite a scream, but something in between. Kane knew it wasn't the storm. And by the way, the girl's body tensed. He knew she recognized it too. The hunters were still out there. And they were getting closer. The sound outside faded back into the storm, but it left an echo in Kane's chest. A warning that didn't go away. He stood still, listening for any sign it might return. But the shelter was quiet, except for the soft hum of the heater and the faint crackle of melting ice dripping from his coat. When he looked back at the girl, she was staring at him, her eyes, glowing faintly in the dim light, never blinked. It was as if she was measuring him, trying to decide if she could trust him. Kane set his rifle against the wall and sat down on the floor a few feet away, careful not to crowd her. "All right," he said slowly. "Let's start with your name." She hesitated, her lips moving without sound. Then she whispered, "Syrah." Her voice was low and soft, carrying an accent that made the human common words sound strange but gentle. Kane nodded. "Syrah," he repeated. "I'm Kane." Her gaze lowered briefly, then came back to his. She seemed to be thinking hard about her next words, finally speaking again. "You human?" He gave a small shrug. "Yeah, that's right." She tilted her head slightly, as if studying the word in her mind. Then she said, "Humans. Dangerous?" Kane almost laughed. But there was no humor in her tone. "Not all of us," he said. "Some of us just live out here, try to survive. Like you." Her fingers tightened around the blanket. "I run." "Long time," she said, her words broken but clear enough. "Storm. Hide me, but they follow." Kane leaned forward a little. "Who's they?" She went quiet, glancing toward the door. Her body shifted. The tail that had been loosely resting now curling in tightly against her legs. "Hunters," she said finally. "Not human, not my people. They take, sell." Kane's jaw tightened. He had heard of slave hunters working the outer systems, but he'd never seen them in action. "They're after you specifically." Syrah nodded once. The motion small but certain. "I escape." She whispered, "They want me back for a moment?" Kane didn't speak. He didn't know her. Didn't know what she had done. But the look in her eyes, fear mixed with something else, told him this wasn't just a criminal running from the law. She was running for her life. "What happens if they find you?" Kane asked. Her voice dropped even lower. "I know." Livelong silence filled the shelter, the kind of silence that felt heavy. Kane leaned back against the wall, thinking he was alone on this outpost. Too far from any human colony for quick help. The storm might keep the hunters away for a little while, but when it passed, they'd be on her again, and anyone with her. Sierra's eyes drifted to the small storage shelf in the corner where his food and water sat. She didn't say anything. But Cain noticed the way she swallowed. He got up, pulled a ration pack from the shelf, and set it in front of her. "Here," he said. "Eat." She looked at it like she wasn't sure if it was really for her. When she didn't move, Cain tore the package open and held it out. She reached for it slowly, her fingers brushing his hand. Her skin was still cold, but not as frozen as before. She took a small bite, chewed slowly. Then another. It was clear. She was starving, but she tried not to eat too fast, as if afraid he'd take it away. As she ate, Cain kept his voice calm. "You said the hunters won't stop. Do they know where you are now?" Sierra hesitated, then nodded. "They track by scent," he guessed. Her eyes widened slightly. "Yes, scent." "And mark?" She touched the side of her neck where the faint glow of her skin markings was strongest. "They see." Even far, Cain's stomach sank. If they had some way of seeing her glow from a distance, hiding would be even harder. The heater gave a soft hiss as it cycled, and for a brief moment, the storm outside seemed quieter. That was when Cain heard it again, faint, almost lost in the wind, but there, a howl, deep and long. Followed by another, closer. Sarah froze mid-bite. Her head turned toward the sound, ears twitching slightly. "They close," she whispered. Cain grabbed his rifle and moved to the door. "Then we'd better be ready," he said. Sierra's voice stopped him. "No," she said firmly. "Shelter. No safe." He turned to her. "You're saying we have to move." In the middle of this storm, her glowing eyes locked on his. Storm. Hide tracks. Only time to go? Cain's instincts told him she was right. If the hunters found the shelter, there'd be nowhere to run. But going out there with her in this condition would be risky. He took a long breath, looking at the door, listening to the muffled howls outside. "All right," he said finally. "We move, but you stay close to me." Sierra pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, her small frame shaking but her gaze steady. "I stay," she said. Cain didn't know why, but the way she said it made it sound like a promise, not just to follow him, but to trust him with her life. The wind slammed against the shelter walls again. But this time, Cain wasn't thinking about the storm. He was thinking about the howls. The ones that didn't belong to the wind. The ones that carried a hunting rhythm, slow, deliberate, patient. Sarah sat on the floor, the blanket still wrapped tightly around her shoulders. But she wasn't shaking anymore. Her eyes were locked on the door, glowing faintly. Cain could tell she was listening to something he couldn't hear. "They move closer," she said softly, almost as if speaking too loud might draw them in faster. Cain checked the heater. The fuel gauge was almost at its last quarter, even if they stayed. It wouldn't last through another full night, and with the hunters out there, staying warm would be the least of their problems. "All right," Cain said, "we're leaving." Sierra's head turned slowly toward him. She didn't ask why. She already knew. Instead, she pushed the blanket aside and tried to stand. Her legs trembled, her thin frame swaying. Cain caught her before she could fall. "You can't walk far like this," he said. "I walk," she replied, her voice firm despite her weakness. Cain grabbed his pack from under the bunk, tossing in the last of the ration packs, a water flask, extra ammunition, and a spare thermal blanket. He handed her one of his old coats. It was far too big for her, but it would trap heat. She pulled it on without complaint, the sleeves hanging past her hands. Outside, the storm roared. Snow and ice whipped across the small window, turning the world into a shifting blur of white and shadow. Cain opened the storage compartment under the floor and pulled out his snow goggles and a second scarf. Handing them to her, "We're heading to an old outpost about 2 hours east," Cain explained. "If we're lucky, it's still standing and it's better defended than this place." Sierra nodded once, not wasting words. Cain slung his rifle. over his shoulder, double-checked the door latch, then looked back at her. "Stay close to me." "I stay," she said, her tone carrying the same promise as before. The door groaned as he pushed it open. The wind instantly clawed at them, dragging snow into the shelter. Sierra stepped out beside him, and the storm swallowed them whole. Snow crunched under their boots. The sound almost lost in the roar of the wind. Kane kept one hand on his rifle and the other holding her arm. Guiding her through the whiteout visibility was barely 10 meters. Shapes twisted in the snow, sometimes rock formations, sometimes trees, but more than once, Kane thought he saw something moving in the distance. Half an hour in, the howls came again. Closer this time, the sound rolled over the storm like a deep drumbeat. Sierra tensed at his side, her tail curling tightly under the coat. "They follow," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. Kane didn't answer, but he adjusted their pace, pushing harder through the drifts. His legs burned from the effort, but they couldn't slow down. The land dipped into a narrow gully, the walls on either side rising into jagged, ice-covered ridges. Kane didn't like it. A perfect place for an ambush, but with the storm raging, it was also the fastest route to the outpost. Halfway through, Sierra froze, her head tilted slightly. "Ears twitching, left," she said sharply. Kane turned, rifle up. At first, he saw nothing, just snow whipping through the air, but then a shadow moved along the ridge, low and fast. Another followed behind it. The shapes were large, hunched, moving with a predatory grace. He fired a single shot toward the ridge. The crack of the rifle echoed, and the shadows melted back into the storm. "Go," Kane ordered, pulling her forward. They pushed through the gully as fast as the snow would allow. Every few seconds, he glanced back, catching glimpses of movement in the white. The hunters weren't rushing them, they were herding them, pushing them in a direction they wanted. The gully opened into a flat expanse of snow and ice. The outpost was still another hour away. Kane knew they wouldn't make it without a fight. If the hunters closed in, Sierra stumbled, nearly falling. Kane caught her, his breath coming hard. "We stop for 1 minute," he said. Helping her kneel behind a mound of snow for shelter, she looked at him, her eyes intense. "They play," she said. "They want me tired." Kane's jaw tightened. "Then we don't give them that." He helped her back to her feet. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying with it a sound Kane recognized all too well, the crunch of snow under heavy feet. He turned, rifle raised, and for the first time, he saw one of them clearly. It was tall, its body wrapped in thick, tattered hides, a mask of bone covering. Its face, long claws glinted in the faint light. Its glowing yellow eyes locked on Sierra, and Kane realized instantly this thing wasn't afraid of him. It wanted her, and it would kill anyone in its way to get her. Kane's finger tightened on the trigger. The hunters had found them, and the shelter was far behind them now. There was no going back. The hunter's yellow eyes burned through the wall of snow. Kane didn't waste a second. His rifle cracked, the shot tearing into the storm. The shadow jerked back, vanishing into the white. But Kane knew it wasn't dead. Hunters like that didn't give up from a single hit. "Move," Kane said sharply, pulling Sierra forward. She stumbled, but didn't resist. Her legs moved faster now, fear giving her strength. The wind roared in their ears, drowning all other sounds. But every so often, Kane caught the faint crunch of heavy steps behind them, always at the same distance, never rushing, just following. The ground beneath their boots shifted. The snow grew thinner, the ice harder. The storm howled down from the ridge, pushing them into a wide frozen basin. Kane didn't like it. The open space meant they could be seen from every direction. Sierra's head turned sharply, her ears twitching beneath the hood of his oversized coat, too. "Right," she said. Her voice was breathless but certain. Kane didn't argue. he changed their path, heading toward a jagged wall of ice at the far end of the basin if they could reach it. They could use the uneven terrain for cover, halfway. Across the howls came again, closer than before. Kane risked a glance over his shoulder. Shapes were moving through the storm, 3 of them now. Tall and wide, their steps slow but deliberate, they were spreading out, herding Kane and Sarah toward the far wall. They don't want to catch us here, Kane realized aloud. They want to trap us. Sarah's breathing was fast. They always play, she said. The wall of ice loomed ahead. Sharp peaks rising like frozen teeth. Kane searched for an opening and spotted a narrow crack, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. He pointed. There go. Sarah didn't hesitate. She pushed herself into the crack, her small frame slipping inside. Kane followed, the jagged ice scraping his coat. The gap opened into a narrow tunnel, the walls glowing faintly blue as light filtered through the ice. For a moment, the storm's roar faded, replaced by the muffled sound of their breathing. Kane pressed forward, his boots crunching over the frozen ground. The tunnel twisted and narrowed, forcing them to move single file. Kane kept his rifle ready. Behind them, faint but growing louder, came the sound of claws scraping ice. They follow, Sarah whispered. Kane pushed her forward. Keep moving. The tunnel split into 2 paths. Sarah glanced at both and chose the left without hesitation. Kane followed, trusting her instincts. The passage widened slightly, enough for them to move side by side again. The air grew colder, sharper. Kane's breath fogged in front of him. They emerged into a hollow chamber. The ceiling high above them, icicles hanging like glass spears. At the far end, another exit glowed faintly with daylight, but before they could reach it, Kane moved across the light, blocking it. Kane raised his rifle. The hunter stepped into the chamber, its claws dragging along the ice. The mask of bone covered its face completely, but its eyes, bright, hungry, were fixed on Sarah. Another shadow slid in from the side tunnel, then a third from behind. The hunters had circled them. Sarah pressed her back to Kane's, her voice trembling. No way out. Kane's mind raced. His rifle could drop 1, maybe 2, but not all 3 before they closed in. He scanned the chamber, searching for anything: a weak wall, a crack, anything that could give them an opening. Then he saw it. High above one of the side tunnels, a ledge covered in thick ice that looked unstable. Hold on to me, Kane said. Sarah didn't ask why. She just wrapped her arms tightly around his waist. Kane aimed high, firing a shot into the weak ice. The sound cracked through the chamber, and a sheet of frozen weight broke loose. Crashing down in a thunderous wave, the nearest hunter leaped back, hissing, as chunks of ice blocked the tunnel entrance. Go! Kane shouted, pulling Sarah toward the far exit. The remaining hunters moved fast, claws scraping over ice, but the falling debris slowed them. Kane fired again, forcing them to duck. They burst into the open air, the storm slamming into them with full force. The basin was gone, replaced by a slope of jagged ice leading down toward a dark line on the horizon, the ruins of the outpost. Sarah's voice was urgent. Down. Kane nodded. They half ran, half slid down the slope, the wind whipping their faces. Every few seconds, Kane glanced back. The hunters were already climbing out of the tunnel behind them, their massive shapes barely visible in the snow. By the time they reached the bottom, Kane's legs ached, his breath burning in his chest. But the outpost was close now, its broken towers standing against the storm like the bones of some ancient beast. They won't stop, Sarah said between breaths. Kane's grip tightened on his rifle. Neither will we. The storm swirled around them, the wind carrying the hunters' howls once more. Closer than ever. The chase wasn't over, not by a long shot, but the outpost was in sight, and if they could reach it before the hunters, maybe just maybe. They had a chance. The outline of the outpost grew clearer through the storm. Jagged towers of metal and stone rising from the snow like the ribs of a long-dead giant. Kane's breath burned in his chest. Every step heavy, Sira kept pace beside him, though her steps were shorter, her coat whipping in the wind. Her glowing eyes never left the dark shape of the ruins ahead. Behind them, the hunters' howls grew louder, rolling over the storm in long, hungry notes. Kane didn't need to look back to know they were closing in. They reached the outer wall of the outpost. Half buried under drifts of ice, Kane shoved his shoulder against the old gate. It groaned but didn't move. He pulled his knife, wedging it into the frozen hinges. Sira stepped forward without being asked, pushing beside him, together. They forced the gate open just enough to slip through. Inside, the outpost was silent. Snow covered the ground, filling the cracks between broken tiles. Rusted equipment lay scattered. Half-collapsed walls formed narrow corridors. Kane knew they couldn't rely on the structure to hold off the hunters for long. "This way," he said, guiding Sira toward the central building. It was the tallest, with thick walls and a single narrow door. Inside, the air was still and cold, but it was shelter. Kane dropped his pack, checking his rifle while Sira pulled the blanket from inside to wrap around herself. The door rattled suddenly. Kane moved fast, shoving an old metal beam across it as a brace. Outside, claws scraped against the wall, followed by a deep, heavy thud. The hunters had reached the outpost. Sira stood close to him now, her voice low. "They come soon," Kane nodded. "Then we make it hurt for them." They worked quickly, blocking the windows with broken furniture and metal scraps. Kane set his last few ammo clips within reach. His hands moved without hesitation, but inside, he knew this was going to be close to close. The first impact shook the wall. Dust fell from the ceiling. Another hit followed. Harder, Kane raised his rifle. Sira crouched low behind an overturned table, her eyes fixed on the door. The bone-masked head appeared first. Forcing its way through the gap, Kane fired, the shot slamming into its shoulder. The hunter roared but didn't fall. Another clawed hand reached through the window slit, swiping wildly. Kane shot again. The room echoed with each blast for several minutes. It was a brutal standoff, Kane firing, the hunters retreating, then rushing again, but slowly. Their movements grew more cautious. The storm outside howled louder, swirling snow into the room, through every crack. Finally, after one last scrape of claws along the wall, the hunters' howls drifted into the distance. Kane stayed still for a long moment, listening. Only the wind answered. "They gone?" Sira asked softly. Kane lowered his rifle. "For now," he said. Though he knew they'd be back once the storm eased, he turned toward her. She was still curled behind the table, the blanket draped over her shoulders, her tail peeked out from under the coat, flicking slightly. When their eyes met, she gave the smallest smile, without a word. She crossed the room and sat down beside him on the cold floor. Her shoulder pressed against his, her head rested lightly against his arm. Kane looked down at her, raising an eyebrow. "You're taking my spot," he said with a faint smirk. Sira's eyes half closed, her voice soft but certain. "No." "My spot." Kane let out a quiet breath, shaking his head. He could have told her to move, but he didn't. Instead, he adjusted the blanket so it covered both of them. The heat of her small frame against his was more comforting than he expected. For the first time since the night began, the tension in his shoulders eased slightly. The storm outside could rage for hours. The hunters could return. And the world beyond this frozen ruin could stay as dangerous as ever. But here, in this small corner of the outpost, there was a strange, unexpected peace. Sira's breathing slowed, her body relaxing completely against him. It struck Kane then she hadn't just chosen to rest beside him for warmth. She had claimed this place, claimed him, as the safest place she knew. "All right," Kane said quietly. Almost to himself, "Your spot." Her tail curled loosely across his leg, sealing the silent agreement. Outside, the wind roared on, but inside, two figures sat pressed together on the cold floor, holding on to the small space between them like it was the only thing in the galaxy worth keeping. And maybe Kane thought it was.